So finishing my, oh, all right. Okay, I got the notification, it started recording. As you mentioned, I'm professor at Universidad Central, also a graduate student at the Universidad de Chile. So what I will present here are some preliminary results of my degree dissertation. So this, this research starts to be contextualized in the structural educational reform in 2014 by former President Michelle Bachelet in her second government, where one of her campaign promises was ensuring nonprofit quality, inclusive, and free education. But however, at that moment, according to Abel de la Torre, according to Abel de la Torre, some students' unions, as well as Colegio de Profesores and other civil organizations, expressed disconformity towards this campaign. The next year after that, the Ministry of Education, Mineduc from here on, following the line of inclusion in education, developed two relevant documents. One of them, the one you see here, a plan for gender equity in Chilean education. And 2 years later, in 2017, some guidelines for including LGBTI plus students in Chilean education as well. However, the evidence mentions that there were not immediate results according to an analysis by Mineduc, in which, in terms of inclusion and equity in terms of gender, with the purpose of reducing the stereotypes, they found out that higher education choices were still following stereotypes, that men were mainly choosing career paths on construction, engineering, and technology, while in the case of women, they were following health, administration, and service programs. Additionally, Rojas and Astudillo, in their review of gender in Chilean education throughout history, emphasized on the civil demonstrations during 2018, in which mainly female students were criticizing the intergender power relations, as well as sexism inside the education institution, and also that there was still a binary conception of genders. With that in mind, the problem lays on what's the role of English teaching regarding these aspects. So for this study, we'll be following a critical applied linguistics research line, which has as its main domains, or one of the most prominent, language teaching. So just like the mainstream applied linguistics, language teaching has also had a main role here. And in this case, Penny Cook, who starts to develop this research line, mentions that all of the language-related problems as a result of human life are subject to an underlying political, social, and cultural frame that influences all of these language-related problems. So in this case, the goal of critical applied linguistics is oriented towards praxis, where the purpose has on the alleviation of some of the pain produced by the unfairness, as well as the possibility of change towards the social justice. So the domains that language teaching has been covering in critical applied linguistics have been mainly gender, class, sexuality, race, and ethnicity, where we will be focusing on gender and sexuality for this study. In this line, Michael Biram, quoted in gray, has been mentioning since the late 80s that there has been a dominant paradigm in language teaching in which the communication has been understood as simply the, sending and receiving messages. A view that he considers impoverished and conservative because it ignores some other aspects like the social and cultural identities of those speakers and how it influences communication. Additionally, he mentions that we are leaving aside the emancipatory potential and reflexivity that language learning can entail. This has also been present here in Chile, where Professor Lisa Swan, not many years ago, mentioned that English teaching has been happening mainly with utilitarian purposes, relegating other educational aspects. Something that also mentions Professor Vivanco who in a more critical way mentions that language teaching has followed a training logic instead of educational, and that has understood languages as tools for international trading, and also students as part of a productive machine. Of course, all of this has some reasons to happen. And in this case, Professor Barahona, analyzing the English curriculum in Chile, focuses on the reform after the dictatorship during the 90s. And she mentions that there was an emphasis on receptive skills because it was thought that it would allow people access to the global economy and information network. Instrumental Goal that also reminds some years later with the adjustments in 2009, where there were some changes in terms of methodology, but as she mentions, this instrumental goal remained, where the goal was to access information, knowledge, and technology, and being competent in a globalized world. So one of the aspects that was left aside, according to what the authors mentioned, was gender and sexuality in EFL teaching, where if we follow a communicative approach for language teaching, we should be understanding classroom as a community of practice. And in this case, Cynthia Nelson talks about the pragmatic limitations of excluding the marginalized identities, because we would be preparing a student for a reality that is not actually like we are presenting it. Having this in mind, the research question of this study is how are genders represented in Chilean EFL textbooks, considering that these instruments are one of the main goals, one of the main sources of exposure to language for high school students. And having this in mind, the relevance of this study, which will be explained in deeper detail in the next slides, has to do with the cognitive approach to gender conceptualization, the problematization of gender and sexuality in teaching English as a foreign language at a local level here in Chile, as well as raising awareness of materials for the teaching practice. As I mentioned, the theoretical framework will start by understanding textbooks as multimodal instruments, according to Professor Farias, who analyzed some of the changes that Chilean textbooks have had, evolving into more sophisticated multimodal elements that have incorporated not only verbal language, but also graphic design in those texts, as well as some visual elements like pictures, videos, and also audio files and recordings. Textbooks have been present in many fields of education throughout the last century, but according to these authors, language teaching has been the field that uses them the most, because they incorporate varied activities. Sometimes they also include the program for the course, and it's a very useful resource for teachers and students. However, following the same view of communicative approach, where we are representing the work, these representations in the textbooks are always partial, according to the authors that you see here, because they will be following the view of a certain author, and that turns them into vehicles of culture and ideology, according to Castro Manso and Pinto. Since they, have cultural ideologies, certain cultural ideology in the content, the focus of critical applied linguistics and textbook analysis has been following two main lines. The one of redistribution that addresses problems regarding socioeconomic inequalities, and another one that is about recognition that focuses on marginalized groups, the one that we will be following from here on. In terms of gender, the way that we will understand it is according to the queer theory, where according to Butler, one of the pioneers, understands gender as performative acts that create the conceptual content of gender, leaving aside other visions like the constructivist and also the determinist view. This also sets fuzzy boundaries between different genders, and by separating it from cultural construction from biological determinism, it opens the door to have more than only two gender categories. However, in spite of how many we can have, Nelson also mentions that these identities are unequal according to the social, cultural, and political frame introduced by Pennycook, because there will be some power relations according to the social structure. So now, having this idea present, the cognitive view of the concept of gender has to do with how we create mental schemas as the result of experience and interaction. So the way that we interact with other people who perform different gender acts will be contributing to our mental schemas of how genders are conceptualized. Now, the way that we perceive this, this experience with other people presents the other people as instances of genders that are similar enough among them to belong to the same category and not to a different one. But however, Langacker and Taylor also propose that the categorical boundaries are always fuzzy and not sharp. Okay, so it can be, so in this case, we can understand that not all the instances of a gender will be the same, that there could be some problems to conceptualize, but in that case, cognitivist element that will be present is the prototypical instance. Okay, that is the one that has the highest hierarchy in terms of that category, because it will be working as the best example of a category to also categorize other instances that are not the best examples of a conceptual content. Now, regarding exactly the conceptual content of the gender categories, we will be introducing them as a series of domains grouped in matrix. And in this case, the domains will also have a different hierarchy. They will be understood as any kind of realm of experience against which we will be conceptualizing those instances that we are perceiving. So as I mentioned, the domains have different hierarchies being distributed in terms of centrality, where the most central domains are the ones that have a highest possibility to be activated in conceptualization. Like on the contrary, peripheral domains will be less likely to be activated when we are perceiving different instances of a concept. Now regarding the methodological framework for this study, sorry, I received a message. The methodological framework, here. It has an intended sample where I chose Teens in Motion 1 and 2 textbooks for primero and segundo medio based on the age of the students, having in present that adolescence is the period where they build their identity. So the data collection was focused on identifying the human instances, where in Teens in Motion 1, the one that we will be working here, had 223 human instances, and in the second book, we had 145. The analytical matrix consisted on identifying the instance, the gender they perform, the domains activated in that gender representation, the elaboration of those domains, as well as some other representative elements mentioned by Machine and Mayer in their multimodal guide for critical discourse analysis that are the ones that you see here. So we have, in this case, the individualization and collectivization in the representation, if it is specific or generic, if there is nomination or simply functionalization, if we have a use of honorifics, the lexical choice, in some cases, the over-lexicalization of some domains, the attributes assigned to the gender instance, the setting in which it is portrayed, some multimodal aspects like gaze and poses, and the salience that it can have in that representation. So in the case of Teens in Motion 1, the one that we will be using for this study, the presence was of 89 women instances, 88 men instances, additionally 31 instances with mixed gender, and further we also had 15 gender instances in which, 15 instances in which gender was not activated, like the ones that we see here. The instance number 21 talks about employers, which has people as referent, a human instance, but which doesn't activate gender in that representation. The same that happens here in instance 108, where of course we have human activity, but what is profiled in this instance is not enough to activate gender. We were not able to identify gender performance in what is presented here. So having this in mind, the domains that were identified were mainly these ones: labor, family, personality, art, sports, and emotions, where most of them were not quite different, but there were some other more problematic, like in the case of sports, when we had 8 men against only 1 woman. Some of the elaboration of these domains were in the terms of labor. We had health administration, modeling, education, communication, and handcrafts, where the one with more instances for men was the education field, and the one with more instances for women was administration, just like in the analysis presented by Mineduk. Additionally, we could found that modeling was the most prominent for women, since there were 6 women, but in this case there were no men, which makes it more salient in terms of representation. For family, in spite of having more instances, most of them were portraying just family relations like brother, cousin, aunt, among others. So the main elaboration of this domain that we used was raising and caring people. Surprisingly, in this case, we had only men, not many, but only men in this case. For personality, we found adjectives with both positive and negative appraisal, with very similar numbers for both genders. For art, again, we had painting as mostly prominent for men, since there were no women, but also in terms of quantity, with similarities of music, and in terms of dancing, the most salient for women. For sports, as it was previously mentioned, there was only 1 woman elaborating the domain of sports by the activity of cricket. While in the case of men, we had the most perform as rugby. There was some other elaboration that were focused on just on interest, not on certain activities. And finally, in terms of emotion, we could find joy, pride, love, and sadness, with also very similar numbers for both genders, as you can see here. Sadness was the only one that had only men, but well, only 1 person in this case. So the matrix of the domains was basically the same for both. We could find the same domains, but in terms of centrality, they changed in the distribution. In spite of having labor as the most relevant, as the most central, the setting changed in terms of the order of the other ones. This took us to create the different prototypes of representation in this textbook. In the case of the prototype of man, we had a work in education, interest in music and painting, being a present father, a praised personality, interest in sport, and also positive emotions. While on the other hand, the prototypical woman was with a work on administration, not deprived by family in this case, a praised personality, interest in dancing, positive emotion, and not interested in sports. So some of the conclusions that we can notice is that there is an equal presence and salience of men and women, but that there is still a binary conception, taking distance from the suggestions and guidelines proposed by Mineduk. The domains were the same for both categories, men and women, but there was some changes in distribution. And additionally, we could notice a reduction, not a complete suppression of stereotypes for prototypical elaboration, which is also positive, but that there are still some aspects to work on, like the case of sport, some other ones like what happens in terms of family, considering that literature talks about mainly women elaborating the family domain with elaboration of taking care of people and raising children. So it is expected that this number increases for men. Some of the limitations that the study also has is that there is the possibility for schools to use other textbooks in spite of the one offered by Mineduc. And that also, since there is a generational difference, students can have a different cultural background as knowledge for the construal of reality. So maybe they don't see the same representations and stereotypes the way we do. So having this in mind, these are some of the references for this study, all of them presented in this presentation. So thank you very much for having been present here.
Thank you very much, Andres.
You're welcome.
A very interesting presentation, and it shows that we still have a long road towards inclusivity. So now we're going to open the floor for questions or comments from the audience. We have 10 minutes for that. So we asked you to write some questions on the chat, but you're also welcome to ask your questions to Andres.
We have one question.
Yes.
So it says, "Hi Andres, interesting study. I'm also studying currently, but from the point of view of how knowledge is built, I wonder how you picture the ideal textbook in terms of gender."
Oh, I can't believe it, Professor Lisa Swan, who I just quoted here. Yes, well, I don't know if there can be an ideal textbook, as I mentioned, from the